On the night of August 29, 1776, the Continental Army stood on the edge of collapse. British forces had surrounded the American position in Brooklyn. Washington knew that if he didn't evacuate his men across the East River, the revolution would end before it had truly begun. The situation should have been hopeless. The British had the high ground, the men, the ships, and the wind in their favor. And yet, as the first boats pushed into the dark water, something strange happened. Officers on both sides described a fog rolling in from the east. It didn't drift down from the hills or rise naturally from the river, but it arrived as a low, dense wall. Soldiers said it moved against the wind, settling between the American and British positions with a precision that felt intentional. Colonists who were present later testified that you could stand 3 feet from a man and barely see the outline of his shoulders. The British scouts said they had lost all sight of the retreating army, even though moments earlier they had clear visibility of the shoreline. Washington used that fog to slip thousands of men across the river in near silence. When the final boat left the shore, eyewitnesses said the fog lifted almost instantly, as if the event had run its course. By dawn, the British realized that their prey had vanished. Historians still argue about the meteorological elements of that event, but those who were there said they didn't see it as weather. They called it providence. This wasn't the only moment like this in the founding era. The story of America's birth is usually told as a political struggle, but behind that familiar narrative runs another one that suggests that the revolution didn't unfold on human terms alone. Welcome to Arcane Station. I'm your host, Mike Porter, and tonight we're digging into one of the most compelling and controversial corners of American history, the possibility that the United States was shaped not only by human ambition, but by supernatural forces, esoteric traditions, strange events, and influences that don't fit neatly into traditional textbooks. Now, this isn't a fringe idea. Many of the people who lived through the Revolutionary era, the soldiers, the ministers, the town scribes, and even the founding fathers themselves, recorded events they saw as miraculous, unexplainable, or guided by a higher intelligence. Some called it divine providence. We're diving into the documented incidents, primary sources, eyewitness accounts, and the actual decisions made by the men who built the country. And throughout this episode, we're working from a simple stance, and this goes for any of my podcasts, that science and the supernatural are not competing forces, that quantum physics and biblical accounts often explain the same phenomena just in different languages, and that people's stories, especially in the matters of paranormal, are subjective truths. When someone says they saw something beyond explanation, I take them at their word, unless there's evidence to prove otherwise. So let's start at the beginning with the world the founders lived in, a world where the supernatural wasn't an anomaly, but an everyday part of life. And to understand why so many supernatural claims surrounded the founding of the United States, it helps to look closely at the culture that shaped the people who lived through it. In the late 1600s through the late 1700s, they weren't secular centuries. They were in a transition period in which religion, early science, superstition, and folklore all occupied the same space. People didn't draw hard lines between these categories. In the 18th century, ministers wrote about comets as divine warnings with the same seriousness they applied to other portions of Scripture. Physicians debated whether invisible vapors influenced the body. Statesmen quoted both the Bible and Roman mythology. This cultural blending wasn't a fringe curiosity, it was the norm. And the colonies themselves were a patchwork of different belief systems. In New England, they maintained a strict Puritan religious foundation where people interpreted unusual events as divine messages. In the middle colonies, mixed Dutch folklore, Quaker mysticism, and frontier superstition. And in the South, they blended Anglican tradition with African spiritual practices brought over by the enslaved peoples and indigenous cosmologies that went back millennia. The revolutionary generation grew up in this environment, which shaped their worldview with their expectations of reality and their interpretations of unexplained events. Early American newspapers routinely printed accounts of strange sightings, such as luminous bodies moving overhead at night during militia training exercises in New Jersey. This happened in March of 1754. Another article from 1760 documented a blazing sphere observed by travelers along the Hudson River. These stories weren't filed under fiction, they appeared alongside weather reports and colonial legislative updates. And on the frontier, supernatural interpretation was even more common. Indigenous nations already had long-standing beliefs about spirit messengers, sky beings, and omens that could influence battles or warn of danger. Colonists living near tribal lands often incorporated those ideas into their own understanding of the natural world. Several colonial officers wrote that tribal leaders warned them of ambushes after receiving visions during ceremonies or dreams. This merging of indigenous and European spiritual traditions created a hybrid worldview, an America where signs and dreams mattered. A powerful example of this is George Washington's survival at the Battle of Monongahela in 1755. This event became more than a patriotic legend. It appears in missionary journals and tribal oral history. Reverend Samuel Davies, a respected minister, delivered a sermon in 1755 recounting the indigenous claim that Washington was protected by forces beyond human intervention. The idea that Washington's life was preserved for a greater purpose took root long before the Revolution. The story climaxed decades later when an elderly chief asked to see Washington as he was close to death. The chief told Washington he was a leader of warriors who fought against Braddock in 1755. The chief had personally aimed his rifle at Washington multiple times, and to be clear, Washington had several horses shot from underneath him, and he would routinely come back to camp with bullet holes in his jackets. This chief was known among his people as a deadly shot, one who never missed. Yet every shot that he took at Washington missed the target. He eventually ordered his warriors to stop targeting Washington altogether because it was useless. He concluded with the famous line, "The Great Spirit protects that man. He will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as a founder of a mighty empire." This prophecy solidified the colonial belief that the cause that they had was ordained. Whether someone saw these events as divine, magical, or merely unusual depended on their background, but almost no one was entirely skeptical. The Enlightenment was influencing the colonies at the time, but it hadn't replaced older worldviews. It sat on top of them. A surprising number of well-educated elites owned books on alchemy, Hermetic philosophy, and classical mysticism, subjects that we would now label as occult. Benjamin Franklin printed works on natural philosophy, which included topics like planetary influence, vital forces, and the nature of the soul. Thomas Jefferson studied ancient Near Eastern myths in the same notebooks where he sketched designs for Monticello. Even skeptics like John Adams wrote about strange impressions and moments of intuition they couldn't fully explain. Crucially, many founders were Freemasons, a fraternity steeped in symbolic ritual and philosophical teachings drawn from older esoteric traditions. Their Masonic involvement showed that symbolism, sacred geometry, and ritual meaning were part of their intellectual vocabulary. While they practiced deism, which is the belief in a creator who set the universe in motion but does not interfere, or rationalism, they often reconciled these ideas with providence, the belief that God could still guide events or just ensure an outcome. This cultural environment is essential because it establishes a baseline. People in the 18th century interpreted supernatural events differently than we do. When they saw a miraculous fog, a sudden shift in the weather, or an unexplained apparition, they didn't default to meteorology or psychology. They assumed the natural and the supernatural overlapped. They believed a divine intelligence could act through nature, and they recorded these events with seriousness. This wasn't a secular nation built by materialists. It was a nation shaped by people who believed the visible world and the unseen world were connected. When you turn from the cultural backdrop of the founding era to the documented incidents themselves, the records become far more detailed and far stranger than most people might realize. These aren't vague stories. Many come from first-hand accounts, preserved diaries, military dispatches, and early American newspapers. They sit in the archives today as written testimony from people who believed they were witnessing something beyond ordinary cause and effect. As we detailed in the opening, the fog at Brooklyn remains one of the most striking events. The primary sources underscore the anomaly. Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, who served directly under Washington, wrote that the fog hung so low and was so dense that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. British Major General William Howe's report also notes the remarkably thick fog and acknowledges that it covered the retreat of the rebel army. The crucial element is the timing. Weather records for that morning show normal atmospheric conditions until shortly before dawn. The fog intensified only after the evacuation began and dissipated within an hour after the final American boat crossed the East River. No eyewitnesses on either side described similar conditions earlier in the night. Another well-documented event occurred during Washington's crossing of the Delaware River on December 25, 1776. Conditions were brutal: sleet, ice, and wind that cut across the water. Several officers, including James Monroe and John Fitzgerald, wrote that the river became unusually still for a short period of time. Fitzgerald's letter to his family describes it. "We observed for a brief interval the river's surface lay calmer than it had the whole of that night, permitting the boats to advance with unexpected ease. Once the crossing was complete and the troops marched toward Trenton, the wind resumed with force, scattering the river ice into dangerous drifts again. Strategically, that brief calm made the successful surprise attack possible." Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 and 1778 contains some of the most controversial accounts. While many soldiers wrote about the bleakness, the starvation, the cold, the disease, their letters also contain references to what several men described as visions, lights, or presences. Sergeant Joseph Plum Martin, whose memoir is a reliable enlisted account, describes nights when men reported seeing figures in the snowfields that vanished upon approach. Another soldier, Luke Harding, mentioned a brightness like lantern flame, though no lantern was present, near Washington's headquarters. These accounts appeared in letters written during the encampment, not embellished decades later. The story of Isaac Potts witnessing Washington in prayer also originates from this period. Potts, a Quaker, recounted seeing Washington kneeling in the snow, the tears coursing down his cheeks, his sword laying beside him. The significance to Potts wasn't the prayer itself, but the atmosphere. He described a stillness about him not of this world. This implies that the sound of the encampment, which is the hammering, shouting, coughing, and crackling fires, was silenced in the immediate space around Washington as he knelt. While skeptics argue that Potts' account was romanticized, variations of the story appear in multiple early narratives, suggesting it was widely believed at the time. In a less dramatic context, even the highly skeptical Benjamin Franklin interpreted a violent thunderstrike near Independence Hall during the Constitutional Convention in 1787 symbolically. In notes attributed to James McHenry, Franklin supposedly remarked that a powerful hand seems to remind us of the seriousness of this endeavor. Beyond the battlefield, supernatural elements appear in key symbolic decisions. The creation of the Great Seal of the United States involved 3 separate committees over 6 years. The final design includes an unfinished pyramid with 13 steps and a radiant eye enclosed in a triangle. These symbols have roots in a classical antiquity, Christian mysticism, and Enlightenment-era esotericism. Charles Thomson, who completed the design, indicated that he chose the eye to represent the favor of divine providence. The question is, what deeper esoteric significance Thomson and others saw in it, extending beyond a simple religious statement. The layout of Washington, D.C. also raises similar questions. Pierre L'Enfant's 1791 plan features broad avenues radiating from the Capitol, geometric star patterns, and carefully placed public squares. Cornerstones for government buildings, such as the Capitol building's first stone laid in 1793, were set in a formal Masonic ceremony. These public ceremonies included ritual tools, invocations, and precise alignment practices documented with an eye towards symbolic meaning. Finally, private correspondence preserves accounts of direct warnings. A letter from Captain Bartholomew von Heer in early 1777 mentions an apparition of a woman clothed in white seen by several sentries near Morristown, New Jersey. Von Heer dismissed it as fatigue, but two of the sentries insisted the figure gave them a warning about an incoming patrol. Hours later, a British scouting party was intercepted near the same location. Taken together, these incidents form a pattern. It's not one event that confirms the supernatural outright, but a steady accumulation of testimonies where probability bends, symbolism deepens, and witnesses, some skeptical, some devout, describe moments that shaped the early republic in ways they could not rationalize. Interpreting the supernatural dimensions of the founding era is challenging because the people who lived through that period didn't separate physical events from spiritual meaning the way that we often do today. To them, the unseen world wasn't hypothetical, it was a part of everyday experience. For the Continental Army, the immediate reaction to strange events was usually spiritual. Chaplains traveling with the troops often recorded their impressions in their journals. Reverend Enos Hitchcock, a military chaplain, wrote that during the War of 1777, "The sufferings of this army are beyond measure, but the signs that we have witnessed convince me that the Almighty yet watches over our cause." He referred to meaningful coincidences, unexpected food deliveries, storms that halted British advances, and near misses that felt guided rather than accidental. Hitchcock saw those not as miracles, but as evidence of a pattern of protection. And for civilian observers, interpretations varied by region. In New England, they framed the supernatural events through providence. Town clerks and ministers connected the revolution to biblical narratives, comparing the retreat from Long Island or the hardships at Valley Forge to stories from Exodus or Psalms. They used this theological lens to understand history, concluding that the revolution aligned with divine will. In the South, particularly the Anglican ministers framed coincidences during the war as quiet confirmation that the hand of God favored independence. And the founders themselves responded differently, filtered through their own intellectual backgrounds. George Washington consistently used language that suggested he believed the revolution was guided by providence. His letters during the war often referenced the interposition of heaven or the favor of providence. While he never personally described visions, he never dismissed the interpretations of others who attributed divine meaning to events that benefited the army. Thomas Jefferson addressed the subject through natural philosophy. He believed the universe followed laws established by the Creator, and that what appeared supernatural was simply a natural law we did not yet understand. He interpreted unusual events as natural phenomena that nonetheless reflected the deeper order of creation. Jefferson redefined the supernatural rather than rejecting it. And Benjamin Franklin was the most nuanced. While skeptical of sensational claims, he also witnessed enough unusual coincidences during his scientific work that he entertained the possibility of forces not yet understood. Though he concluded Mesmer's animal magnetism was psychological, he speculated in private correspondence that human intention could influence physical experience, an idea very close to quantum consciousness theories centuries later. The British reactions also offer valuable insight. Officers wrote candidly about the frustration of losing tactical advantages due to weather or timing. In some reports, British commanders noted that the American forces seemed to benefit from fortunate circumstance or inexplicable advantage. One officer wrote after the failed pursuit near Princeton that our prey slipped from us by means I cannot attribute to strategy alone. For a trained military mind to admit that speaks to the impression these events left. After the war, institutional interpretations shaped how future generations understood the founding. Early 19th century historians often highlighted providence as a theme. This led to a long-standing tension between those who saw divine intervention and those who preferred natural explanations, often influenced by Enlightenment rationalism. Modern psychology adds yet another layer, suggesting that people under extreme conditions like trauma or high stress during war often report heightened awareness, vivid dreams, and unusual sensory experiences. This doesn't negate the events, but suggests that human consciousness responds to crisis in ways we still don't fully understand, a point that aligns with the idea that the mind and reality are intertwined. What becomes clear is that the supernatural elements in America's founding were meaningful to the people who experienced them. Whether interpreted as divine intervention or unexplained anomalies, these events shaped how individuals understood the destiny of the new nation. When we examine the supernatural claims attached to the founding, the documented events are only part of the picture. The persistence of this subject lies in how those events align with broader patterns found in high strangeness, quantum theory, and ancient symbolism. One modern framework often applied to historical anomalies is the threshold moment theory. The idea that major turning points in human civilization tend to coincide with spikes in unexplainable phenomena. Researchers have noted that periods of upheaval seem to create conditions where the boundary between the ordinary and extraordinary becomes thinner. The Revolutionary period fits this pattern perfectly. The colonies were undergoing political transformation, military crisis, and a complete redefinition of their identity. In environments like that, witnesses throughout history have reported everything from prophetic dreams to luminous figures to sudden atmospheric changes. The founding era's unusual incidents may reflect this broader pattern of reality behaving differently at civilizational crossroads. The symbolic architecture of the new nation also invites speculation. The geometric layout of Washington, D.C., the placement of its monuments, and the precision of Pierre L'Enfant's design have led some researchers to argue that the city was deliberately constructed as a kind of cosmogram, a map of symbolic forces intended to align the nation with higher order. Architectural historians acknowledge that Enlightenment thinkers believed that geometry had moral and spiritual value. The design elements, including the Capitol's placement on Jenkins Hill, and the ceremonial cornerstone rituals reflect an attempt to anchor national identity within a powerful symbolic framework. The decision to use an unfinished pyramid and a radiant eye on a great seal goes beyond simple religious piety. The symbolism traces back through Renaissance esotericism and classical texts. This intentional and repeated use of profound symbolism suggests a founding generation that saw the establishment of the Republic as a metaphysical act, not just a political one. Some scholars push this idea further by examining how the founders viewed the landscape itself. Many indigenous nations believe specific locations held spiritual power. Mountaintops, springs, valleys, and ancient burial mounds. These beliefs were not unknown to colonial leaders. Joseph Brant, the Mohawk diplomat who wrote in 1779 that the Americans encamp upon places our ancestors believed full of spirit. Archaeological evidence shows that several revolutionary encampments and colonial meeting sites overlapped with pre-existing indigenous sacred sites. The idea that America's founding unfolded on spiritually charged terrain is a reoccurring theme in both indigenous oral history and later esoteric interpretations. High Strangeness researchers also examine the founding era through the lens of non-human intelligence, entities described across cultures as angels, messengers, or guides. While the term interdimensional being is modern, the experiences are ancient. In various traditions, luminous figures appear during moments of crisis or transformation, offering warnings or reassurance. Some historians argue that the apparitions reported at Valley Forge fit into this category, as do the prophetic dreams recorded by soldiers and civilians. If the same type of being appears in the village raids in medieval Europe, in spiritual ceremonies in the American Southwest, and frontier battles during the Revolution, it raises the possibility that these encounters reflect a universal phenomenon described through different cultural languages. And quantum theory provides yet another interpretive pathway. The idea that observation influences reality, that probabilities collapse into outcomes under certain conditions, and that consciousness interacts with physical systems, and that offers a model for understanding improbable events in history. During the Revolution, entire communities prayed for specific outcomes. Armies acted with unified intention, and leaders made decisions under extreme stress. Some researchers argue that these conditions create fields of collective consciousness that increase the likelihood of synchronistic events. In this framework, the fog at Brooklyn or the calm on the Delaware aren't miracles or coincidences. They're the natural result of consciousness interacting with a probabilistic universe. Each of these speculative approaches suggests a moment in history where physical events, spiritual meaning, and hidden forces aligned in ways that continue to influence the identity of the United States. Looking back across the historical record, the eyewitness accounts, the symbolic decisions, and the cultural interpretations, it becomes clear that the founding of the United States was not a simple political event. It unfolded inside a web of experiences that people of the time understood as spiritual, symbolic, or outright supernatural. When they wrote down what they saw, the atmospheric lights, the shifts in the environment, the prophetic dreams, improbable escapes, they were trying to make sense of what they believed was happening around them. The events themselves deserve a second look, as many defy straightforward explanation. The timing, the precision, and the repetition of similar patterns across different battles and locations create the sense that something larger was moving beneath the surface of the war. Whether that something was divine providence, a form of natural law we don't fully understand, or the influence of non-human intelligences depends on which interpretive framework you believe best fits the evidence. But the evidence itself, the part that comes from diaries, letters, military reports, and newspapers, is substantial. The real takeaway is the recognition that the people who lived through these events were observing their world through a lens that included both science and the supernatural. They saw nature as a tool of the divine, and consciousness as a force that mattered. The events of the Revolution fit into a global pattern where nations are shaped not just by human plans, but by moments that feel guided, nudged into place, and influenced by forces beyond the visible world. The luminous figures at Valley Forge resemble reports from contemporary encounters with unknown intelligences. And in this Valley Forge event, the luminous beings showed George Washington the future, what America was going to become. And he took that into battle with him. And these strange symbols embedded in the Capitol's architecture mirror ancient traditions. And when you consider how deeply quantum theory has blurred the old boundaries between physical and metaphysical, and how observation affects matter, how probability shapes events, it becomes easier to accept that the supernatural events recorded during the Revolution might not be exaggerations or misunderstandings. They may simply be descriptions of phenomena we don't have a full, complete language for yet. Did the United States come into existence through strategy, sacrifice, and human determination? Absolutely. But were those the only forces at work? The record suggests otherwise. The founding is filled with events that don't fit inside a strictly material worldview. The accounts of those who lived through the revolution deserve to be treated as genuine experiences, not, curiosities or allegories, but the truths as they understood them. The supernatural was unquestionably present at the birth of the nation. So thank you for joining me tonight on Arcane Station. If you, enjoyed this episode, or if it gave you something to think about, please consider subscribing, sharing it with a friend or someone else who might be interested or curious about history and the unexplained. Until next time, remember, the line between the known and the unknown is thinner than most people realize. Have a good night.